Darkness swallowed the room as the last fluorescent light flickered and died, leaving behind a cold void filled with unseen whispers. In the corner of the laboratory, cluttered with tangled charts and incomplete equations, a man sat motionless. His eyes were wide open, reflecting the dim glow of a computer screen, where an unusual string of characters danced like demons on an endless black canvas. It was no longer just a theory, no longer a mad assumption of misguided scientists. Everything he had proven, the laws, the formulas, the seemingly immutable concepts, was now collapsing. There was a crack in reality, a distortion in the laws of physics, and in that moment he understood. Madness was not a product of the human mind, but an inevitable part of the universe itself. Everything begins here, and no one can stop it.
What would become an apocalyptic plight worldwide began as a normal day. I rushed out the door to get to school as the news showed the weather and traffic reports. But today was history in the making. The news had been reporting for days on the Hadron Collider experiment. 1 million quarks, atoms, neutrons, protons, and electrons would be shot from opposite sides of each other. Scientists wanted to see what would happen in such an environment with opposite particles being forced together at high speed. We would be watching in physics class, since scientists worldwide predicted that something bizarre would occur. Now, there have been protests in front of the White House and the Capitol for days though, and not all the population was happy to see this experiment go through. If the experiment was a success, it would basically be like an energy light show inside the collider, and if it wasn't successful, no one knew what would happen. Some scientists speculated that a black hole would appear right inside the Hadron Collider and would suck up all of the Earth in a matter of an hour. The chances of any going wrong scenario were around 1%, but with all the scenarios that existed, the chance of it failing in some horrific way was high. At school, my first hour was physics, and we were lucky enough to be sitting, watching live on ABC as the collider was about to be used. My friend Keith leaned over and said to me, "Close your eyes." "Why?" I asked. "Might not be pretty," he replied with a grin. "Maybe the world will explode or split in half." I almost laughed at the thought of Earth just suddenly ripping in half and turned my attention back to the TV. The countdown began for the experiment, and the camera was focused on the glass and plastic super collider. 3, 2, 1, the voice said. "Ignite." The super collider turned on, and suddenly there was a blinding flash. The glass shattered and shards tore across the room. And suddenly, the scene switched to the outside. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's been a horrific accident inside the collider. It seemed that although the world hasn't ended as some were afraid, the experiment has." Smoke floated out of the building, and I heard flames crackling. Suddenly, there was a second explosion, and the entire landscape was lit up. A large hole tore into the air. How it was possible, I couldn't explain. It was like a hole tore into the image of the laboratory, as if the whole thing was a painting. Something flew out, and suddenly a blue emotion soared out of the hole. Dark purple smoke oozed out of the tear in space and time, and half the class began talking loud. Out of the blue, something tackled the cameraman to the ground, and blood soaked the screen. Something thin and sharp, a projectile, struck the news reporter in her neck, and she collapsed a few feet away. The camera sat there, cracked, and switched to the newsroom. "Something's happened," the anchor stuttered. He then broke down. "My family lives in Illinois. I gotta go warn them." He darted out of the room, and a commercial replaced the empty news. Now, we live in Peoria, and the Hadron Collider was a mere 20 miles from our school. The next 5 minutes were chaos. Frightened students and several staff made frantic efforts to escape. Our room was on the side of the school with only one window, and someone picked up a chair and tossed it through the glass. The fire alarm sounded and the door shot open as the other students climbed out of the window. 20 miles to the northwest, a large black pillar of smoke began rising up. Flashing explosions shot out of nowhere in that direction, suggesting that the disaster wasn't over. A window to the 3rd floor of my high school shattered, and a boy fell out. He landed on the grass, got up, and limped away. More windows began breaking, and I saw people climbing out and being lowered out from the 2nd floor. Someone grabbed my shoulder. "Let's get out of here," Keith yelled. "This might be the end of all this. Take a look at the school, it might be the last you see of it." In the parking lot, cars were backed up as terrified parents came to get their children. One car headed toward the curb, and as it did, a second car struck it. Flames shot out of the hood of the one, and both were smashed. The doors to the high school were unhinged, and several injured kids were laid out on the lawn. As I watched this unfold, Tyrell darted toward me and Keith. His head had a large gash on it, and he was limping. "What the hell happened?" Keith cried out. "I was coming from the bathroom, and as I got to the east wing, this mob of crazies almost trampled me," Tyrell replied. "What the hell's happening?" "The experiment at the collider went wrong. I'll tell you more later," Keith answered. We fled the scene and soon reached my house. "It's locked. My mom and dad are at work in Springfield," I told Keith. Keith walked a few steps away, picked up a stick, and suddenly charged at the glass front door and began striking it. It started cracking. "You idiot, what are you doing?" I screamed. "Well, we have to get inside the house," Keith said. "Getting in might save our lives." The glass shattered and we entered. "Grab any food and find water," Keith said. "I'll get the batteries, and Tyrell, you get the toiletries and toothbrushes." "Sure thing," Tyrell replied. He darted upstairs. Keith headed for the garage and I started in the pantry. I packed the food into a garbage bag I found in the foyer, and I proceeded downstairs to grab extra food. We regrouped in the garage, and Keith suggested that we needed a car. "Both my parents are gone," I said. "Where are we going to get a car?" Keith grinned, pulled out a paperclip, and said he had an idea. "No," I yelled. "We're not going to steal a vehicle." "Any better ideas?" Keith replied. We headed next door, broke in, stole more food, and then headed to the garage. "I've got it," Keith told us as he fumbled with the ignition. "Hey, who's in my house?" a man yelled from outside. "Shit," I whispered. "We're dead." I heard a gun cock and footsteps approach the garage. "Got it," Keith screamed. He hit the gas and reversed, smashed through the garage door as a gunshot cracked the windshield. The garage door fell and slid off the car as a second gunshot pierced the confusion. As the man walked out onto the street with a shotgun, we floored and sped off with the third shot echoing behind us. As we reached the nearest road, I saw a house with the door wide open, and looters exiting and entering. I saw the same thing in several locations as we drove dangerously through Peoria, cutting corners and nearly striking pedestrians. Panic had spread fast, and a line of cars was crowded in front of the Sunoco near our school. I could hear sirens wailing across the city and the occasional gunshot. A fire engine passed me with its lights flashing. We reached Interstate 74 in downtown, and already it was crowded. We decided against being trapped in it and took Washington Road out of town. We soon were surrounded by farms and grass and out of the chaotic city. And that's when Tyrell turned around and alerted us to the bizarre cataclysm beginning. "Whoa!" Tyrell yelled. "Holy shit, man!" I turned and gasped. A large, deep purple cloud had appeared to the northwest where the collider had been. It was thick and looked like a strange ball of haze. It was widening fast, and within an hour, it covered much of the northwestern sky. "What is it?" Tyrell asked. Keith shivered, and all I said was, "Something bad. It's really something bad." Tyrell wasn't shaken up as much as us since he hadn't seen the TV report. "Yeah, but what's happening?" Tyrell asked more urgently. "Would somebody please tell me what the hell we're running from? Why is Peoria going insane? Why are we driving at near 90 miles an hour to the east?" "Shut up. I'm trying to drive," Keith yelled. I turned and looked Tyrell in the eye. "You don't want to know," I said. "Yes, I do," Tyrell replied. "Fine," I said. I took a deep breath. "That cloud isn't just a bad accident," I said. "The purple fog is something unknown to man. And while you were away, everything went awful. The collider exploded right as the experiment occurred, and then this portal appeared right where the laboratory once stood. That purple fog floated out, and something else exited too. We saw a motion of blue, and something attacked the reporters. Both were killed where they stood. Blood splattered on the screen, and it went to static. The news anchor darted from the room to phone his family, and after that, everybody panicked. I guess they all heard the rumors that the world might end, and when the lab exploded and a hole opened up in space and the reporters died, they realized it was happening. Tyrell was silent. Then he began speaking. "Is it a black hole?" he asked. "No," I said. "It didn't suck anything in. Something came out." "Something?" Tyrell responded. "Something alive," I said. "Some kind of monster must be in that dark pillar of fog, the one that murdered the reporter and cameraman." Tyrell shivered violently. "Is it headed for Peoria? Are we safe? Can we escape?" "That's what we're doing," I yelled. "Hopefully by going east we can escape the terror. Just hope my parents are okay." I woke to chirping birds and light, and I sat up. Keith was warming a can of food over a makeshift fire he had started. The sky was void of a bizarre planet, and I wondered if it was a dream. "Did you see it?" Keith asked. "Seen what?" I replied. "The planet. It appeared out of a hole in space," Keith replied. I gasped. It wasn't a dream. I had seen a real planet appear from out of nowhere. "Yeah," I replied. "Well, it wasn't a dream," Keith told me. "I listened to the news this morning, and they said that this planet is at a strange distance from Earth. The large 500-foot tall tidal wave had torn across much of Western Europe, killed half the population. The wave also hit West Africa and the Azores. It was now on course for Australia and Indonesia. Worldwide casualties were predicted, and people along California's coast were heading to the mountains to escape. Los Angeles will be underwater by tonight, as would be San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, Vancouver, Portland, Salem. "We've got to get to higher ground," Tyrell yelled. I was confused. "Why? We aren't on the coast." "Well, if we don't, we'll be killed when the Pacific Ocean washes over the United States," Tyrell replied. "Most of America will be underwater." I was startled. Suddenly I remembered the fog. I turned and was shocked to see a purple cloud covering half the sky. It was everywhere. It had to be a few miles away. "Let's go," I cried. We reached by nightfall. We were in Grayling. The city was several hundred feet above sea level and would be a great place to stop. As I began to close my eyes, I heard the sound of water flowing. I opened my eyes and saw water fill the town. It was a foot deep here, but anywhere else in our country, an ocean had formed. The news the next day was only out of ABC, who had retreated to the mountains near Los Angeles. Every other news station was destroyed. Looting is now widespread in any place that survived the floods. Most of the US today is flooded over, and the world has been fully engulfed with water. Meanwhile, the purple smoke had been seen spreading over most of America. I turned and gasped. The cloud of purple was so close. Hills only several miles from town were veiled by it. The sun shone through a bit, but very little pierced it. It drew near, and by midday, all of the town was engulfed in it. The air had a bizarre quality in it that seemed harder to breathe. It also had an odd smell to it. It just can't be described. Harmonics in this fog of darkness were weird too, since even nearby noise sounded far away. A truck driving outside sounded like it was on one of the hills a few miles out. I had to yell to Keith, even when I was only a few feet from him, just so that he could clearly hear me. After a few hours, we boarded a plane heading for Traverse City. From there, we could fly to Denver, where the US was regrouping. We reached Traverse City in a short time, and our plane to Denver took off around 3. As we soared over Wisconsin, I gazed down at the ruined farmland below. Debris floating in the water, and I could see the buildings of St. Paul and Minneapolis sticking out of the ocean like ancient monoliths. Outside, it was like the evening. There was enough light to see the fog passing by, but still not much. It was a while we flew through this bizarre cloud that strange things began happening. A loud, melancholy cry sounded somewhere outside the plane, sending shivers through most of the passengers. "What the hell was that?" Keith whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know," I replied. Tyrell gazed out of the window but saw nothing. "Remember how we saw movements on the TV screen when the portal opened up at the ruined collider?" I asked Keith. "Yeah," he replied. I continued, stuttering and shaking in fear. "Well, then the reporters were killed. I wonder if something is actually lurking in the fog." We were silent. I slumped in my seat and feel no safety until we reached Denver. We drew closer and closer, and finally, when we were only 20 miles from Denver, I let out a sigh. Suddenly, something struck the plane. A large shape hit the window next to us, cracking it. 2 large glowing eyes gazed in at us, and Tyrell screamed. Keith jumped up to grab the nearest fire extinguisher, and the window shattered. There was a blur of motion, and Tyrell was sent into the next row. Another fast blur, and the woman who'd been sitting in front of us was a bloody, decapitated corpse. Red liquid covered the wall and soaked several seats. A fast blur darted through the air, and blood soaked the aisle. Keith aimed and fired the extinguisher's liquid at the flying creature. It screeched and crashed headfirst into the bathroom. It reared up on its hind legs, revealing its hideous form. The being was 7 feet tall, with large bat-like wings. Its face was 2 glowing eyes, and a mouth of simply 2 pincers and rows of teeth. It let out a growl, and a spear-like projectile shot from its mouth. The object struck Keith in the arm and pierced right through it. Blood soaked me, and Keith screamed. Right as the being was about to attack him, there was a gunshot. The monster's head exploded and black blood soaked the area. I turned to see Tyrell standing behind me with a handgun. "I found a dead marshal with this. You can thank me later." There was another sound of shattering glass and a scream. Blood oozed from the cockpit, and we snuck over. 2 other marshals were dead, and we took their guns. I told both of my companions to be silent as we got ready. We burst into the cabin, and chaos erupted. The monster lunged and was killed. A second creature tackled me, and I stuck the gun in its mouth, pulling the trigger. Its head tore backwards, and black fluid filled the cockpit. More creatures appeared at the window, and we kept firing. The cockpit's instruments were destroyed, and the plane's wheel was torn off. The aircraft suddenly took a sharp turn and began a spiraling descent. We killed several more monsters, and the plane slammed hard into the ground. Dirt piled up against the window, and there was an explosion in the back. When it was over, my friends and I were soaked in blood and injured. I stumbled into the hallway to see most of the passengers were dead. Only a few passengers were still alive, and 2 were injured. Tyrell kicked open the door, and we gazed out. Several people were scattered around the plane, and I heard sirens approaching. I sighed and collapsed. We made it. We were safe. Several weeks after the accident at the collider, Keith, Tyrell, and myself had found shelter in the Broncos Stadium in downtown. We had food, running water, cots, and safety. The sky was always a dark purple, and at night it was pitch black and devoid of stars. It was on the 30th of June that it happened. Scientists stated that satellite images showed a third portal open up in space, and for several days, a large dark portal hovered by Earth. It was on July 4th the situation changed. At noon, the TV screens in the stadium were suddenly lit up with breaking news. Several huge asteroids exited the hole and began orbiting Earth. One struck the moon, and a large piece of rock flew off and directly struck Central Africa, killing hundreds of thousands, and 3 other asteroids just barely grazed Earth. The chunk of Earth rained back down as meteors on the other side. The remaining space rocks were hurled into space, and one struck the ghost planet between Earth and Mars. Then it got scarier. On July 10th, it changed. Recent evidence showed that 3 portals formed a bizarre triangle, and they exerted a force on the gravity binding planets to the sun. In exactly 3 weeks, Venus was supposed to strike Earth, and Mercury would be swallowed by the sun. The asteroid belt was already distributed, and the rocks would pound Mars into a cratered, flaming hell. The only cause of this disaster was the Hadron Collider. The solution was unknown. Also, the moon had basically left Earth's orbit and was now its own planetoid, orbiting the sun. Keith's hopefulness for survival faded. The news that we were on a collision course with Venus finally killed his hopes. He slumped in his cot all day and slept more than usual. And finally, after a week, I asked him why he was so upset. "Dude, you don't get it? Dude, we survived so much," I told him. "Look, even if Venus is on a collision course with us, we aren't the side that'll be hit. It's supposed to strike around where Europe is." Keith looked up at me and began tearing up. "Don't you understand?" he asked me. "Don't you realize that this is it? Venus is the size of Earth. When it hits this planet, we'll completely explode. Nothing will be left. That's a guaranteed death sentence. Worse yet, I wish we were on the side getting hit. Then we'll instantly die. We'll be vaporized and crushed, and now we get to be launched off into space and die from lack of oxygen and air pressure. We'll die the most painfully." I was horrified. We were the unlucky ones, and we would all die. We'd escaped the tidal waves, the monsters, the asteroid impacts, and the riots, but unless we left Earth's surface, which wasn't going to happen, we were dead. This was 100% likely. I had only 2 weeks, and after that, nothing. I found Tyrell in the church nearby praying. "You heard the news?" I asked. He nodded. "I can't believe this is it," he said. "We escaped death so many times, but guess you can't cheat death and win." I was solemn. "You believe in God?" Tyrell asked me. "Nah, I just don't." Tyrell looked at me and said sadly, I'm not sure if I believe totally either anymore. Look at this situation. Millions, maybe even billions, are dead worldwide. The Earth is riddled with craters, ruined cities, and death. It's covered by this purple haze. If there is a God, this must be Armageddon. This is the final battle. After this, if the Bible's right, we all go to paradise. I raised an eyebrow. What do you think it'll be like? Tyrell asked. What do you mean? Death in the afterlife, Tyrell responded. I mean, is death fast? When you go to heaven, are you immediately there or do you travel there? Is it like a tunnel? You go to the end and enter the afterlife? I shrugged. I don't know. I didn't make heaven. Tyrell pulled out his phone and said, I kept it a secret, but my dad called. I was surprised. Where is he? I asked him. Dead? Tyrell told me. He called a couple of days ago. He said him and Mom were stuck in Cedar Rapids. Mom was dying of a bullet wound. I guess they got robbed in Davenport and it went wrong. Dad called as night was falling. He told me he knew it was almost time and said him and Mom loved me. I heard a loud sound of rushing water and the phone went dead. Pretty sure the tidal wave got him. I looked down at the ground. I'm not sad though, Tyrell told me. Why? I asked. Well, I'll see him again on the other side, he responded. You'll see your parents too. We'll all be happy again. He broke down. He wept loudly for several minutes, and I went into a rage. Don't you see? I screamed. We aren't going to just die and pass on, Tyrell. No, we get to be the unlucky ones. We'll be at a position where the Earth strikes Venus. This chunk will fly off with the other pieces. Gravity will decrease rapidly. The oxygen will disperse. We'll float away and we'll suffocate, freeze, burn, and tear apart slowly and painfully. Picture it. Several minutes of pain and agony as you float in space, burning, freezing, and drowning without water. He became hysterical and darted out of the church. The horror, the sadness, anger, and helplessness was too much for him, and I felt a twinge of sadness too, realizing that after a 17-year life, I was going to die like this. And why did I deserve this? A week from the supposed impact, news appeared. The portals in space were fading and likely about to vanish altogether. This altered the disturbance on gravity, and Venus was no longer supposed to make a direct hit. However, it would still dangerously graze Earth, causing disaster where it neared. The new model brought it over Europe and America, but it technically wouldn't strike Earth. Instead, the surface of Venus would come within 100 miles of Earth's surface at its closest point and 1,000 miles by us. But the results would be disastrous. No one knew exactly what would happen, but it would be the final blow to Earth. Millions would likely die and Europe would be rendered uninhabitable and devoid of life. We had a small chance of survival. Likely a few million lucky people would remain alive in America, but most of the people around us would be injured or killed in the disaster. I informed Tyrell and Keith, and both of them lost some of their depression. We prepared for the grueling hours of disaster that were to come, and when the day came, we met at noon on the top floor of the Wells Fargo Center. We didn't have long to wait. The large, smooth outline of Venus appeared on the horizon, and it made its way up and across the sky. The wind began picking up, and I felt as if an invisible force was pulling on me. I told the two that we likely weren't safe, and we left. By the time we reached the first floor, the electricity was out. As we exited, a large tree collapsed. I felt as if I would be lifted off the Earth itself, and we finally reached the Broncos Stadium. By this time, Venus was almost directly overhead. The entire sky, except for the western horizon, was a fiery orange, and the wind was unbearable. I told Tyrell and Keith that we had to reach the basement of the building. We found a maintenance staircase, and as we descended, the roof of the stadium tore away, and countless people were levitated slowly up. I could hear screaming and panic, and soon we had to climb downwards as the gravitational force of Venus tugged at our bodies. We reached the basement and found ourselves lying on the ceiling. I felt as if I would be crushed, and Tyrell told us to lay on our sides. We did, and for hours, I screamed. I screamed until the pain stopped, until I had to hold on to the ceiling to keep from falling. Finally, gravity returned to normal, and I fell. "Well, we survived," I stated. "We're the winners here. This is it, time for life to return to." And at that moment, the remains of the stadium fell back to Earth, smashing through the ceiling and trapping us. I woke up in darkness to the sound of water dribbling and flames crackling. The smell of smoke hung in the air, and I sat up. "Tyrell? Keith?" I cried. "Sam?" Keith screamed back at me. "You okay?" "Yeah, I'm just bruised and bleeding a bit. Where are you guys?" "I'm over here," Keith told me. "I'll shine the light from Tyrell's phone for you." He turned it on and I crawled through the debris towards him. "Thanks, Keith," I said. "Where's Tyrell?" "He's really injured," Keith told me. I looked to my right and I saw Tyrell laying next to Keith. His left arm was gone and his right leg was maimed bad. Blood soaked him and his head was gashed. He was unconscious. "I found him pinned under a slab of debris," Keith said. "His arm was totally crushed and his leg was too. I cut the rest of his arm off so I could drag him out. I stopped the bleeding, but he's really injured. He'll probably not survive." I was on the verge of total collapse. We sat in the fortress of falling concrete for several days, hunting rats and eating worms. Tyrell woke and we fed him, but his health only slipped more and more. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. All I remember next is the sound of saws and voices, then being pulled out of the ruin, then laying in a hospital bed. "Where am I?" I asked. "You're in a medical tent in the Boulder Survivors Camp," a voice told me. I turned to see a nurse standing nearby. She wasn't frowning or smiling, but simply straight-faced. "You finally came out of insanity," she told me. "You were rambling about Judgment Day and that you wanted to die. We knew you would eventually get better. As for your friend, he looks like well, he'll likely pass away soon." I sat up. "Which one? Who is he?" "We found a young African-American male with you and the other man inside the ruins. He's missing limbs and fading fast." I got out of bed. "Take me to him." I approached Tyrell's bed and gasped. He was patched up and immobile. He gazed at me and smiled. Keith sat nearby. "The doctor said I'm going out," he rasped. "I guess this is it." I teared up. "No," I said. "No, you're going to live. You have to survive. I mean, look at what we've been through." Tyrell smiled a bit and said, "I did survive. I didn't die like so many others. I'm still here after the apocalypse. I've seen the new day. This is the Earth after the disaster. You'll live on and meet new people, and you'll someday even meet a woman who'll be your wife. We'll have children and you'll keep our kind going. Maybe you'll even name one Tyrell. Funny name for a white child, but damn, who cares? We are one, we're human. We all represent mankind, the race that almost went extinct from its own curiosity. You'll continue as well as Keith. I may not, but you'll remember me someday and we'll meet again. If not this life, then in the next. Been a good friend, Sam. You also been a good friend too, Keith. Remember." The monitors slowly flatlined, and I broke down into tears. Keith and I both hugged each other and wept. I mean, sure, men usually don't hug, but here we were, at the dead foot of our friend, in a lonely, ruined world. I hoped Tyrell was right. I hoped I could meet a woman. I hoped I would see Tyrell again. And I knew only time would tell. Years went by, society repaired itself. From across Earth came masses of survivors. People of various races, religions, and nationalities found their way to the mile-high city's remains. And together we built a new nation, known as Anthropopolis, the city of mankind. Democracy was set up. Tolerance was viewed, and a society of something like a utopia became ours. Outside of Colorado was a countryside of marauders and robbers, and other nation-states appeared in Asia and Oceania. However, we were united under the existence of being human. I met my wife Anne when I was 20. She was from Japan and spoke very little English. However, we learned each other's languages and soon had a family of 3 kids and an amazing dog named Wookie. My kids were named Max, Tara, and yes, to fulfill their prediction, Tyrell. Keith and I lived near one another, and we saw each other a lot. I think he was married a few months ago. And looking back, I never thought I'd live in such a new, amazing, and wonderful world. But still, I miss my friends and family who lost their lives. On Sunday, I received a knock on my front door. I got up and approached, looking out the window to see an old man staring back. I opened it up and said, "Come in." He walked in and sat on the couch, which was unusual for a stranger to do. Also, there was something familiar about this man, as if I knew him. Was he a relative? Who was he? But somehow I knew him. "Do I know you?" I asked the stranger. He looked at me, got up, and came over and hugged me. "Son, don't you remember me? I'm maybe several years older and worn from the disaster, but I'm still your father." Tears welled in my eyes as we both began crying. My mother entered. She too looked worn from the years apart and the disaster, but I didn't care. Here we were, front door wide open, standing there, hugging and crying.
Reality is fracturing. Are you ready to plunge deeper into the abyss of forbidden knowledge? If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't lose your way through the layers of reality. Turn on notifications, because sometimes the truth only reveals itself to those who dare to listen to the whispers of the void. Leave a comment below. Do you believe that science can unlock doors to things humanity was never meant to know? See you in the next video, if you're still here. Or perhaps we've already met in another reality.